The subcommittee will come to order. After recognizing myself and Ranking Member Deutsch for 5 minutes each for our opening statements, I will then recognize other members seeking recognition for 1 minute, and I hope that you do give a statement. We will then hear from our witnesses. Thank you, gentlemen, for being here. And without objection, your witnesses' prepared statements will be made a part of the record, and members may have 5 days to insert statements and questions for the record, subject to the length limitation in the rules. The Chair now recognizes herself for 5 minutes. As the conflict in Syria continues, the numbers become even more staggering every day. Over 100,000 killed. 1.85 million refugees have fled the country, with over 500,000 going to our friend and ally Jordan, placing an extreme burden on our ally as it struggles to cope with the pressure of this mass influx and as the conflict threatens to cross its borders. And an additional 4.5 million Syrians have been internally displaced. Assad remains defiant, and in fact, his intransigence has become further entrenched thanks to the support from its allies such as Iran and Russia. Iran, along with North Korea, has been cooperating with Syria and the Assad families for decades now, aiding Syria with its nuclear and chemical weapons program, as well as its ballistic missile program. Damascus is Iran's linchpin in the Middle East. Tehran reportedly helped finance Syria's secret nuclear plant, designed and built by North Korea and destroyed, thankfully, by the Israelis in 2007, and has also been linked with helping Assad expand his chemical weapons stockpile. According to assessments by U.S. intelligence community, it judged with high confidence that chemical weapons were used by Assad on numerous occasions against the opposition, further amplifying the threat to the region and our national security interests. Tehran has provided Assad billions of dollars in direct funds and recently extended an additional $4 billion line of credit to help fund his brutal campaign against the opposition. Iran has sent military advisors and personnel to help Assad. Members of Iran's elite Revolutionary Guards have been sent to advise and fight alongside Assad's forces, as well as to help recruit external forces to come to the aid of the regime, including a large number of Iraqi Shiite militants and, of course, its proxy, Hezbollah. The Obama administration continues to take the misguided approach that negotiating with Tehran will bear fruit, but the actions of the regime say otherwise. Due to the lack of urgency on this administration's part to prevent Iran from becoming nuclear capable, I am also concerned that it is not giving the Iranian threat the priority and the immediate attention it requires. Last Congress, I authored and the President signed into law the toughest sanctions yet on record against the regime in Iran. Later this afternoon, the House will vote on, and we hope pass today or tomorrow, Chairman Royce's and Mr. Engel's Nuclear Iran Prevention Act, which will further strengthen sanctions against Iran and send the Supreme Leader a message that a nuclear Iran is not an option. So it is perhaps fitting that we are here today discussing this subject, especially with our distinguished panel of experts. But as we all know, Iran, along with Russia, has been a key arms supplier for Assad's forces. There are daily flights from Iran to Syria filled with arms and supplies for the regime. These flights continue to fly over Iraq with near impunity, and the United States must do more to urge al-Maliki and the Iraqis to interdict and prevent these arms deliveries from reaching Syria. The Iran-Syria Nexus has very serious complications and consequences for our friend and ally, the Democratic Jewish State of Israel. The conflict is threatening to spread to Israel's borders, and the fear of Assad's chemical weapons being moved and falling into the wrong hands is very real. Yet the Obama administration, prodded by some in Congress, has decided to send small arms and ammunition into the war zone. I have always been and continue to be opposed to arming any rebels in Syria. I remain opposed to doing so. Instead of sending more arms, we should be looking at ways to stop the arms flowing into Syria from Iran, from Russia, and we should be looking at breaking the Iran-Syria Nexus. We must keep the pressure and increase sanctions on Iran and Syria. In the wake of last month's election in Iran, I must continue to caution the administration on offering more concessions to a state sponsor of terrorism that continues to undermine the stability in the region. No concessions and no waivers should be issued by the Obama administration until we see concrete and verifiable proof that Iran has begun to dismantle its nuclear program. I must reiterate that this new leader is not the moderate that many have been so eager to believe in Iran. It is the supreme leader who still calls the shots, and his nefarious ambitions have not been altered. And with that, I'm pleased to yield to the ranking member of our subcommittee, my Florida colleague, Mr. Deutsch.
Thank you, Madam Chairman, for holding this hearing. Thanks to the witnesses for being here. Iran's destabilizing influence in the region, particularly in Syria, threatens to reshape the future of the Middle East by strengthening extremists, by undermining moderate states, and by fueling a dangerous arms race. In its current state, Syria is slowly on its way to a worst-case scenario. With the help of Iran and Hezbollah, Assad appears to have stabilized his grip on western portions of the country, ensuring continued Iranian influence, at least for the foreseeable future. Factor in the use of chemical weapons and the spillover of violence into neighboring states, and we're dealing with a staggering political and humanitarian crisis. The stats speak for themselves. In a country of 21 million inhabitants, nearly 8 million need humanitarian assistance, at least 100,000 have been killed, 4.5 million have been internally displaced, and 1.8 million have sought refuge in Lebanon, Jordan, Turkey, Iraq, and Egypt. A shocking average of 8,000 people flee Syria every day, a rate of refugee outflow unseen since the 1994 Rwanda genocide. Amid all the human suffering, it's difficult to remember that the Syrian conflict was once a mass civic movement advocating for greater political freedom. Now it's morphed into a civil war between an externally armed insurgency and a brutal regime backed by Iran. Essentially, Syria has become a proxy war for competing regional forces like Iran. From the beginning, Iran has provided arms, military advisors, and enormous financial assistance to bolster Assad. The opposition estimates that Iran is providing Assad with more than $500 million a month and is flying in about 5 tons of military cargo per day. Earlier this spring, my colleagues and I sent a letter to Prime Minister Maliki asking him to inspect Iranian planes using Iraqi airspace. This, coupled with Secretary Kerry's efforts, have led the Iraqi government to inspect about 1/3 of the Iranian flights. It's a good step by the Maliki government, but we know this isn't good enough, as Iran is able to manipulate their flight schedules to ensure that their weapons go to Syria unabated. Therefore, we must continue to press the Iraqis to search all flights to actively prevent weapons from flowing to Assad's forces. The removal of Assad would deal a devastating blow to the Iranian regime's ability to get heavy weaponry into Lebanon. From terror attacks in Europe and Latin America, Hezbollah has long done Iran's bidding around the world. In Syria, Hezbollah has openly intervened on Assad's side with more than 5,000 fighters and is largely responsible for Assad's reclaimed territory in the areas around Damascus and the city of Homs. Simply put, Hezbollah's operations in Syria have become a game changer. Iranian Hezbollah intervention has spurred greater sectarian tension, with almost daily calls from regional Sunni leaders for a jihad against Iran and Assad. However, we have seen the Gulf Coast countries react constructively with planned sanctions against Hezbollah. It is likely that these sanctions will be more potent than those imposed by the EU. Europe has taken an important step, but they and we can go further in sanctioning Hezbollah. Unfortunately, the secondary outcomes of this conflict are far more negative than positive. Lebanon and Iraq, 2 states with tenuous power-sharing agreements, are seriously threatened by a spillover of sectarian violence. The economic burden of hosting refugees is threatening to destabilize Jordan. And Hezbollah's involvement has only furthered a frightening arms race among the region's extremists. For example, last month, a group of hardline Islamists in Kuwait auctioned off cars to raise cash to arm 12,000 Syrian rebels with guided missiles, heat-seeking missiles, and tandem warheads. My colleagues and I are right to worry about how arms might end up in extremist hands. But we've got to face the facts. The extremists already have them. So what's next? We know that if the Syrian regime survives, Hezbollah will be strengthened and Iran's interventionist policy will only result in more aggressive behavior. Yet numerous questions remain. How do we safely support any moderates in Syria? What, if any, change will a new president have on Iranian decision-making in Syria? And finally, in an economy that's being strangled by sanctions, how do we put more pressure on the Iranian regime to end their support for Assad? What more can we do to pressure the Iranians? Thank you, and I look forward to hearing from the witnesses on these and many other questions.
Thank you so much, Mr. Deutsch, for your opening statement. The following members have requested 1-minute statements. If you're not on the list, please let us know. Mr. Shabbat, and then Mr. Schneider, and Mr. Kinzinger. We'll start with Mr. Shabbat of Ohio.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and I have a markup in judiciary, so I'll be being back and forth, so I apologize for that in advance. The terror imposed upon the Syrian people by the Assad regime with the help of the Iranian mullahs is horrifying. Since last spring, estimates suggest that nearly 90,000 people have been killed, and the mass exodus of refugees to neighboring nations continues unabated. The humanitarian crisis is getting worse by the day. In previous hearings over the last year or so, some of us have expressed skepticism about the steps that the Obama administration was taking or not taking in Syria, and concerns that the U.S. efforts would not ultimately result in Assad's removal from power. Here we are today, and the Assad regime is still thriving because of the supply of weapons, fighters, and cash from Iran, creating an even more dangerous environment which is destabilizing the entire region and threatening the security of nations like Israel, Jordan, and Lebanon. Iran wants Assad to win this fight because his removal would be a decisive setback for its own nefarious plans in the region. Consequently, the mullahs in Iran are doing whatever they can to ensure it preserves its influence, no matter what happens in Syria. And I yield back.
Thank you very much, Mr. Shabbat. Mr. Schneider.
Thank you, and thank you to the witnesses for joining us today. The insertion of foreign fighters, weapons, and financial support from the Iranian government into Syria in support of the Assad regime has been well documented. We know definitively that Iran has also worked through its proxy, Hezbollah, to further assert its influence over the current conflict in Syria, and has seen some success in swaying the momentum that once appeared to favor the opposition forces. I look forward to hearing from the panel on several related topics, including how prolonged Iranian influence could contribute to the breakup of the current Syrian state and the implications for long-term U.S. interests and interests of our regional allies. I am increasingly concerned that the fighting between Kurdish, al-Qaeda, Jabhat al-Nusra, opposition forces, and other militias in Syria will only provide greater space for Iran to exert its influence over the future state of Syria to the detriment of our interests and that of our allies. I look forward to hearing from the panel on these issues, and I yield back.
Thank you very much, sir. Mr. Kinzinger.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And I've been very vocal about my concern about the lack of policy and the lack of focus of this administration when it comes to the Middle East. The situation in Syria is one that many of us were discussing 2 years ago, 100,000 lives ago, and I believe that then was the time for action to be taken, at a point when you had a moderate opposition and we had the ability to get in there and ensure that Assad didn't survive. When I was in Iraq as a military guy, one of the worst-kept secrets in Iraq was the role that Iran was playing in that war and the lives that Iran has personally cost American soldiers. I've been concerned at the lack of a clear red line for this administration when it comes to Iran's nuclear weapons, when it comes to Iran's support for bad people all around the globe. And I think it's important that this administration be very clear that Iran will not get nuclear weapons. And now that we see the joining of forces between Iran and Syria and Assad, I think this administration needs to be deadly clear that continued relationship like that will have long-term devastating results for the Iranian regime. With that, I yield back.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Any other members seek recognition? If not, I'm so pleased to welcome our witnesses. First, we welcome back to our subcommittee Ambassador John Bolton, a foreign policy senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute. Ambassador Bolton was appointed as the permanent representative to the UN in 2005, where he was a leading voice for, I would say, the only leading voice, but maybe there are others, for institutional reform at the UN and also against international proliferation and terrorism, and a strong advocate for human rights. Prior to this, the ambassador served as Undersecretary of State for Arms Control and International Security from 2001 to 2005. Thank you for your service and welcome back, sir. Next, we're so pleased to welcome Mr. Mark Dubowitz. the Executive Director of the Foundation for Defense of Democracies, where he leads projects on sanctions, nonproliferation, and countering electronic repression. Mr. Dubowitz is the co-author of 8 studies on economic sanctions against Iran, and he is also the co-chair of the Project on U.S. Middle East Nonproliferation Strategy. We welcome you, Mr. Dubowitz. Third, we welcome Dr. Daniel Brumberg, a senior program officer with the Center for Conflict Management at the U.S. Institute of Peace, where he focuses on issues of democracy and political reform in the Middle East and the wider Islamic world. Dr. Brumberg is also an associate professor at Georgetown University, a member of the editorial board of the Journal of Democracy, and the chairman of the Foundation on Democratization and Political Change in the Middle East. Welcome, gentlemen. As I said, your statements have been made a part of the record. If you could keep your remarks to 5 minutes, that would be groovy. Ambassador Bolton.
Thank you very much, Madam Chairman, members of the subcommittee. I appreciate the opportunity to appear before you today. I thought perhaps it might be useful to look at the Syria-Iran nexus from the strategic perspective of the entire region in the Middle East, because so much is going wrong, almost all of it adverse to American interest. From the disintegration of Libya after the overthrow of Gaddafi, to the turmoil in Egypt, the civil war in Syria, the disintegration of Yemen, the political turmoil in Bahrain and other countries, the effective loss of representative government in Iraq, and obviously the ominous presence of Iran. Events in the region, I think, are closer to slipping out of control and becoming more adverse to the United States than in any historical period I can think of since the 1956 Suez Canal crisis, that period up until the Six-Day War in 1967. And yet we have at the moment in Washington and in Europe a return to the notion that if only you could solve or at least make progress in the Israel-Palestinian issue, that somehow everything else would be easier to resolve. And yet, if you look at each and every one of the crises gripping the region that I mentioned, all of them taken together have almost nothing whatever to do with the Israel-Palestinian issue. And if tomorrow we learn that the negotiators had resolved the Israel-Palestinian issue, that would have almost no consequence whatever for the ongoing threats to stability in the region and American interest. So given that there are only 24 hours a day and given that everybody has to prioritize, I think from the perspective of protecting American national interest, we have to ask ourselves, what are the key priorities? What are the main threats to our interest and strategic stability in the region? And while they're not responsible for everything that's going wrong, it seems to me that all of the major problems we face stem from Iran, from its pursuit of geographic and political hegemony, the arc of influence it's created from Iran itself through the al-Maliki regime in Iraq, the Assad regime in Syria, and the terrorist Hezbollah in Lebanon. One element, it's Iran's continuing support for terrorism, Hezbollah now, as before, Hamas in the Gaza Strip. Iran for decades has been the world's central banker of terrorism, supplying arms and other assistance as well. And then the third major threat, obviously, is Iran's nuclear weapons program, 20 years in the search for a deliverable nuclear weapons capability. Virtually all of Iran's objectives are being pursued without effective response from the United States. The sanctions that we have pursued have, in the words of the Director General of the International Atomic Energy Agency, Yukio Amano, just a month ago, effectively had no consequence on the Iranian program. Personally, I think the sanctions are a good idea because they put pressure on the regime, and our ultimate objective should be bringing the regime in Tehran down. But nobody should be under any illusions that Iran is determined enough to have nuclear weapons, and the sanctions won't deter it. It's also no surprise that Iranian Revolutionary Guards officers and others, and now Hezbollah, have come into the conflict in Syria. Iran was always prepared to shed a lot of Syrian blood to keep the Assad regime in power, and it will continue to do that because the influence it has over Syria fits all three of its objectives, including, I believe, more that we will find out in the area of nuclear, biological, and chemical warfare. The Al-Kabar reactor destroyed by the Israeli Air Force in September of 2007 didn't get there accidentally, and there may well be other aspects of Iranian influence. And I think it's critical for Iran to maintain the viability of Hezbollah as a threat to Israel. Indeed, if Israel makes the critical decision that it's now facing, whether to take preemptive military action against the Iranian nuclear weapons program, the third time in its history that Israel will have done so in its own self-defense, I think the most likely Iranian response will be to unleash Hezbollah and Hamas to rocket targets inside Israel, which simply makes this question that much more difficult for Israel. And yet, in response to all this, the American policy is not just ineffective, it is very sadly lacking. I think we are in for much greater danger in the coming years. Thank you, Madam Chairman.
Thank you very much, Mr. Ambassador. Mr. Dubowitz.
Chairman Ross-Layton, Ranking Member Deutsch, distinguished members of the subcommittee, thank you for inviting me to testify and for having this hearing on the Iran-Syria Nexus. The more we talk about Iran's machinations in Syria as a window into the soul of the Iranian regime, the better. The Iranian regime does not want the world to talk about its involvement in the massacre of tens of thousands of Syrians. As we are only 4 days away from the inauguration of Iranian President-elect Hassan Rouhani, I will focus on the consequences of his election for Iran's role in Syria and the appropriate U.S. policy response. The election victory of Mr. Rouhani has revived a myth as old as that of the revolutionary theocracy itself, the myth of moderation. Were Mr. Rouhani a truly different kind of Iranian leader, he would insist that Iran and its terrorist subsidiary Hezbollah stop assisting the Assad regime to murder Syrians. He would end the repression of Iranians and fully comply with Iran's nuclear obligations under international law. This optimism, however, may not be warranted. And indeed, if his moderation is only aspirational on our part, Washington could easily allow Iran to solidify its grip on Syria and develop an irreversible nuclear capability. I would argue that it would be naive to expect a significant shift in the foreign and security policies of the Islamic Republic. To summarize the conclusions of my written testimony, number one, maintaining significant Iranian influence in Syria and expanding its nuclear weapons program are both strategic priorities for Tehran. In both cases, Iran is successfully testing the red lines of the United States and the international community. Number two, Iran's supreme leader handles Syria policy with operational control in the hands of Major General Qasem Soleimani, the Revolutionary Guard's Quds Force commander. Most Iranian presidents, including Rouhani, have little say over Tehran's foreign and national security policies. The exception was former President Rafsanjani during his first term, when Ali Khamenei still was consolidating his position as the supreme leader. During the duration of the Syrian war, Mr. Rouhani has been the personal representative of the supreme leader to the Supreme National Security Council. In this role, if Mr. Rouhani has had any influence on the regime's Syria policy, then he has been complicit in the slaughter of tens of thousands of Syrians. Even if he has influence, Mr. Rouhani's public statements reveal that his conspiratorial, anti-American, and anti-Israel positions on Syria are closely aligned with Iran's supreme leader in the IRGC. His few statements against so-called extremism, terrorism, and foreign interference reflect Assad's position, which is to label the entire uprising against his rule as terrorism and not a genuine popular uprising. Unlike on the issue of Syria, Mr. Rouhani has been publicly critical of how his predecessors have conducted nuclear negotiations. His record, however, reveals that he has been a practitioner of nuclear deceit and suggests that he cannot be trusted on the Syria file either. Finally, if Mr. Rouhani wants to prove himself an influential and reliable interlocutor, he must end Iran's nefarious military and financial activities in Syria. But let's be clear, stopping the massacre of Syrian Muslim and Christian women and children should not be rewarded with concessions. It should be the definition of moderation. U.S. policy should be designed to treat Iran's Syria and nuclear policies in the same way that Tehran views them, as two sides of the same coin and essential strategic elements of Iran's drive for regional hegemony. Washington must respond to tangible action, not political rhetoric, and be cautious of opportunities for Rouhani to engage in strategic deceit at the proposed Geneva II conference on Syria and at the next round of diplomatic talks with the P5+1. U.S. policy should be designed to accomplish the following 5 objectives. Number 1, resist diplomatic linkage between Iran's nuclear program and Syria. Linkage will only give Tehran more concessions with which to trade and undercut our negotiating leverage over Iran's nuclear program. Number 2, massively intensify sanctions pressure on Iran. Right now is exactly the wrong time to be offering meaningful sanctions relief. Number 3, enhance the credibility of military force. Targeted U.S. strikes against Iranian-backed assets in Syria, similar to what Israel has reportedly undertaken, or through carefully vetted U.S. proxies, will enhance Washington's negotiating leverage on both the Syrian and nuclear tracks. Number 4, avoid a negotiated settlement that allows Iran to retain a critical capability, either in the form of an Iranian-backed Alawistan or an industrial-sized nuclear capacity with undetectable breakout. And finally, number 5, resist the political pressure to sweeten the deal on the assumption that this will strengthen Mr. Rouhani's moderate position in the Iranian political structure. We should not be negotiating with ourselves. Put the onus on Mr. Rouhani to demonstrate his influence and moderation. Only when Washington has reversed Iranian strategic gains on Syria and its nuclear program can there be any negotiated settlement that protects the security interests of the United States and its Middle Eastern allies.
Thank you very much, sir. Dr. Brumberg.
So sorry, I'm going to start again. Good afternoon, Chairman Ross-Lehtinen, Ranking Member Deutsch, and other members of the subcommittee. I'm honored to have this opportunity to testify today before the House Foreign Affairs Subcommittee on the Middle East and North Africa. Today, I would like to place the question of Iran's relations with Syria and Lebanon's Hezbollah in a wider framework. Indeed, the question I will address is how the June 14th election of Hassan Rouhani to the presidency might shape Iranian foreign policy or aspects of it. I should emphasize that the views expressed in this testimony represent my own assessment and do not reflect the positions of the United States Institute of Peace, which does not take policy positions. Both before and after his election, Rouhani stated that he and his new government would strive to regain the trust of citizens at home and to rebuild Iran's frayed relations abroad. By reform, Rouhani seems to mean opening space for the return of those political leaders and groups that were previously excluded from politics and ensuring that these groups and the wider populace have some basic civil rights. But he also argues that pursuing these domestic goals requires diminishing international conflicts that former President Ahmadinejad and his hardline allies used to justify repressing the reformists. Rouhani and his allies appear to believe that reducing international tensions will facilitate a reopening of the domestic political arena. The chances for Rouhani's achieving limited success on the domestic front are not bad, if only because a wide spectrum of groups, including some within the so-called principalist camp that had supported the former president, now argue that reviving the economy and regaining the people's trust are vital to reviving the Islamic Republic's battered legitimacy. But on the international front, moving from confrontation with the West to engagement or cooperation will face significant obstacles. Those obstacles include ultra-hardliners who are loath to see the reformists use success on the international stage to strengthen their popularity at home. Given the influence of these hardliners, Rouhani and his allies are unlikely to depart from the national consensus regarding security issues. Thus, he will not risk provoking retaliation from hardliners and certainly the supreme leader by advocating a fundamental change in Iran's approach to Syria or Hezbollah. But even as he pays close attention to these red lines, Rouhani will probably continue looking for opportunities to promote a more flexible foreign policy, one that might ease the political situation at home. My bottom line is this: while the U.S. should be cautious, we should not dismiss such efforts out of hand or take actions that inadvertently reinforce opponents of a political opening. We should instead test Rouhani and his government. Pushing, I believe, for a Palestinian-Israeli deal, I still think is important, and pursuing negotiations on a comprehensive nuclear agreement might offer 2 tests. How Rouhani and his new government might respond to such tests is unclear. The fact that he's nominated former Iranian UN Ambassador Javad Zarif to be foreign minister, and that he has nominated impressive technocrats to take charge of economic policy are both fairly encouraging signs. Now, these developments reflect long-term social and political dynamics. Indeed, reformists and moderate leaders from the principlist camp itself have been trying to seek an alliance as far back as 1999. Among other reasons, they sought this alliance in a bid to repair the economic damage to Iran that resulted from the previous policies of Ahmadinejad. Rouhani and his allies have stated that advancing these economic reform agendas will require a new engagement with the West and quite possibly with the U.S. One key objective in pursuing engagement will be to remove international sanctions. But the vision and agenda that Rouhani favors is larger than that. To reiterate, Rouhani and his allies see success at the home front as depending partly on success abroad. Rouhani's previous role as chief negotiator on the nuclear issue gives him some credibility, certainly at home. Moreover, the fact that Rouhani and his allies hold that removing or mitigating international sanctions is crucial to advancing their domestic agenda suggests an opening for U.S. diplomacy. The U.S. wants to make progress on crucial security issues, particularly the nuclear question, but it also is important to encourage realistic changes for a reopening of Iran's political arena. After years of repression, Iran's reformist leaders and the wider electorate, which elected Rouhani, crave such domestic change, but they also know that the struggle for change will take years, and it will only come through making accommodations at home. It is in the interest of the U.S. to find ways to make the task of long-term political change possible in Iran while addressing our fundamental security interests. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Brumberg. I'll ask questions about seeing Rouhani as a moderate, Russia's role in Syria, and what will Iraq do. Ambassador Bolton, you said that those who have been labeling Rouhani as a moderate are naive in their assessment, and Mr. Dubowitz, you agree that Rouhani isn't the moderate that the world is so eager to say he is, yet the administration has been willing to accept the narrative of him as a moderate, and has even begun to offer concessions on sanctions against the regime ahead of its next failed round of P5+1 negotiations. And just this morning, the Institute on Science and International Security assessed that Iran is expected to achieve the critical capability needed to produce weapons-grade uranium by mid-2014 without being detected. So as Iran continues to support Assad by reportedly agreeing to supply Assad with $3.6 billion in oil in exchange for the regime to have the right to investments of various kinds in Syria, I think it's wise to be reminded that in the past, this so-called moderate has boasted of his ability to deceive, as you pointed out, and mislead the international community on Iran's nuclear program when he served as the chief negotiator, and he continues to support the brutality of Assad. Given what we know about Rouhani and these latest reports, why would the United States risk our national security and the security of the region by offering concessions to the regime when it is clear that there will be no change in Iran's nuclear position and its role on Syria? And will the administration, do you believe, now use Iran, allow Iran to use Syria as a bargaining chip for its nuclear program? That's what I see in the horizon. Now, on Russia, along with Iran and China, they've been flooding Syria with arms for the Assad regime. It has a key strategic interest in selling arms to Assad, having access to all of that region through the Syrian naval base. Moscow has moved to stonewall U.S. efforts in calling for Assad to step down, continues to obstruct our sanctions against Syria and Iran. It's got its veto power at the Security Council. So it's clear that the administration's reset policy with Russia has not resulted in any progress whatsoever. It has actually weakened our position relative to Moscow. So given this, in light of this and Russia's continued cooperation with Assad and with Iran, what steps should the United States take regarding our policy toward Russia? And on Iraq, we've been saying that we've called on Iraq to act and stop and inspect the planes that are routinely flying militants and militia to fight alongside Assad. But in only a few cases has Iraq actually done this inspection. And in addition, the Iraqi government continues to ignore a request to honor its commitment to protect the people of Camp Liberty through its Memo of Understanding of 2011 and continues to put their lives in danger. Does the U.S. have any leverage or credibility with Iraq to force it to act on any of these issues? Ambassador Bolton.
Well, on the first point, Madam Chairman, on Rouhani as a moderate, I mean, I think his career demonstrates he's a man of the regime for 30-plus years. He wouldn't have been allowed to run for president unless it was clear he would hew to the policies, particularly in the nuclear area, of the Supreme Leader and the Revolutionary Guards. I watched him in action very closely during the period 2003-2005 when he was Iran's nuclear negotiator. And he was very smooth, charming. Western European diplomats just loved to deal with him, and he took them to the cleaners day after day after day, negotiating a supposed suspension of Iran's enrichment program that was suspended because of the failures of the program itself, difficulties in the uranium enrichment process, and even more importantly, difficulties in the uranium conversion process that allowed Iran during this period of goodwill to fix the problems, then break the suspension, and return to its nuclear weapons program. So I think he has shown he knows how to do it once before, and I have no doubt he'd like to do it again. Would he like to see...
Let me turn to Mr. Dubowitz for maybe Russia's role or Iraq's role.
Well, let me talk a little bit. Let me talk a little bit about this question of his record. I mean, let's remember that he was nuclear negotiator and/or the Secretary of the Supreme National Security Council when Iran did not voluntarily or transparently disclose Natanz or Fordo or Isfahan. So it's a record of nuclear deceit. On the issue of sanctions, I mean, I support massively intensified sanctions on Iran to bring it to the verge of economic collapse. I think it's the only way to put the Supreme Leader to a fundamental choice. But I think the sanctions sanctions relief that I'm most concerned about are not the humanitarian sanctions that Treasury clarified last week. It was a statement of clarification. They were not new sanctions. But the fact that there have been sanctions on the books that have not been enforced, like the gold sanctions that have given Iran up to $7 billion in just under a year of vital foreign exchange reserves. And it's the unwillingness to entertain new sanctions, it's the non-enforcement of existing sanctions, which is sanctions relief. We are already giving Iran sanctions relief, and we're getting no nuclear concessions in return. And finally, on the issue of linkage, I think the issue of linkage is very important, Madam Chairman, and that is that the Iranians will try to expand the negotiations to include Syria and their other interests so that they can trade concessions. And we have to be very careful not to link the Syria issue with Iran's nuclear program. On Russia and Iraq, they are both sanctions busters. We are not enforcing sanctions against either country, and they are both in violation of our financial and energy sanctions.
Thank you very much. Thank you, gentlemen. My time is over. Mr. Deutsch.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. Mark, I just wanted to follow up with Mr. Dubowitz, with where you left off. What is it, and I'd throw this open to all three of you, what is it that that needs to happen for sanctions to have the best chance of working? We're going to pass legislation this afternoon that will aim to strengthen the sanctions. We can give you, all of us sitting here can give you the statistics about the successes that the sanctions have yielded in terms of really tightening the economy in Iran, and yet the numbers, the statistics about what Iran is doing in Syria, the amount of money, the amount of supplies, are staggering. How's that happening, first of all, given where their economy stands? Is there any issue of public pressure that may help with Iran's involvement in Syria? We know the Iranian people are frustrated with the state of their economy. It was an issue for Rouhani in the election. Are they aware of the extent of Iranian involvement in Syria and the cost ultimately to them So that's the second question. First question, though, is sanctions generally, what more can be done?
So I agree with Ambassador Bolton that sanctions are not going to be a silver bullet. There's no evidence that they've slowed Iran's nuclear program. But I think that we can fundamentally change the calculus of this regime by massively intensifying the sanctions and increasing the credibility of the military threat. With respect to sanctions, the only number that I think matters is the size of Iran's accessible foreign exchange reserves, because that is their principal hedge against a balance of payments crisis and economic meltdown. If we don't know that number, then we don't know when they economically drop dead. And we have no way of comparing that number to David Albright's number, which is Iran's obtainment of undetectable nuclear breakout by June of 2014. We have to know which comes first. And I think by going after their foreign exchange reserves, denying them access to overseas accounts, going after their oil export revenue, their commercial trade, we have to get Iran closer and closer to the brink of economic collapse. But we need to know that number, and if we don't know that number, we don't know where we're at.
Dr. Brumberg?
Well, I'll have to disagree with my distinguished colleague. I think that the dependence on sanctions is a flight from reality. The notion that by increasing sanctions we are going to compel Iran to do something it doesn't want to do is simply a substitute for a strategic policy. It's not a policy. It's easy to agree on, it's easy to get consensus on, but it's not an effective policy. It hasn't worked so far. I see no evidence that if you put a gun to the heads of the Iranian leadership, they are going to say, we will do what you want us to do. It hasn't been successful. And when something doesn't work, you don't keep repeating it. That's not a policy. Now, sanctions, there are two ways we can think about sanctions. Sanctions are always a means for some sort of end. Sanctions can be a means of a war policy. From the vantage point of Iran, and if Iranian leaders were listening to the presentations today, they would say, well, clearly the point of view, and our colleagues have basically said this, the point of view of sanctions is regime change. Now, if that is your message, then that is your message. Then, of course, if you want to make war, you make war. Right. But if sanctions is an adjunct for negotiations and is a bargaining chip, then you have to be ready at some point or other to conceive of a deal in which you are going to remove sanctions, because sanctions are there in order to compel your adversary to make peace, and that means a dual-track approach. So I'm not saying that one or the other is best. I think we have to decide what we want to do. And ultimately, if we want to go to war, we go to war, because this is what's been advocated here today, in effect. But if we don't, we have to recognize that concessions will come down the way, and at some point or the other, we will deal with this regime, because it's not collapsing today or tomorrow.
Well, Ambassador Bolton, a lot of us sitting up here believe that sanctions haven't yet caused the supreme leader to change his commitment to nuclear weapons, because they've not been strong enough, right? Isn't that the alternate argument? Well,
that's the theory. I actually agree with Dr. Brumberg up until the point when he started talking about going to war. The sanctions are not working, and they're not going to work. There is a theoretical case that economic sanctions can work with three conditions: that they are utterly comprehensive. Everything is covered, number one. Number two, that they are complied with by every major power in the world. And three, that they're enforced by military force. None of those three things apply to Iran, nor will they ever. The nuclear weapons program is not expensive enough for the sanctions to have an effect on. And the proof of the pudding is Korea, North Korea, the most heavily economically sanctioned country in the world, has detonated 3 nuclear devices.
Madam Chairman, may I ask for 30 seconds for Mr. Dubowitz to respond to the suggestion that North Korea is an example here. You've spoken to the need for strengthening sanctions. You've spoken to the opportunities that we have to further tighten the economic noose so that the Supreme Leader changes his ways. Can you speak to ultimately the potential effectiveness of that your two colleagues on the panel seem to argue against?
Well, there's no doubt that sanctions will not work on their own. I think we've all stated that. But I think that it is actually wrong to say that sanctions can't put enormous pressure that we can convert into negotiating leverage at the table. If Iran only has $20 billion of accessible foreign exchange reserves, and that those reserves are being depleted rapidly, Iran is facing economic collapse. Now, if economic collapse cannot break the nuclear will of Mr. Khamenei, nothing will, and there will be no nuclear deal with no concessions that Mr. Brumberg would at all entertain. On the other hand, we need to try, and I think that we don't need military force to enforce sanctions. We need to massively ratchet up the current sanctions regime, which is putting enormous economic pressure on the regime, and get those FX reserves down to a level where the supreme leader does not have the money to support his economy. Mr. Rouhani was elected because the Iranian people are sick of the sanctions, they are sick of the economic pressure, and they're sick of the nuclear intransigence that Mr. Khamenei has shown.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Deutsch. Mr. Kinzinger.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and again to the witnesses, thank you for being here. I would take just a very slight issue with what Mr. Brumberg said. I think, actually, it's not necessarily that we're advocating for war. I frankly think Iran has been at war with the United States for a very long time. I mentioned in my opening statement, I'm a veteran of Iraq. I flew planes, and if I could say in this setting, which I can't, I don't think, but I will say that a lot of energy was focused on Iran basically being involved in the war in Iraq, and in some cases, some have suggested that almost half of U.S. casualties were a direct result of Iranian technology or Iranian action. And I just want to say, too, on the outset, I'm not critical of this administration because I'm a Republican. I'm not critical of this administration because there's any partisan politics involved. If this was a Republican administration with the same policy, I'd be saying the exact same thing. But I'm a believer that when leadership around the globe retreats, something has to follow. And if there's no other leader that's stepping up or able to step up, which in this case there isn't, when the United States retreats from engagement around the world, I think chaos follows. And I think that's what we're seeing in the Middle East as a result of, frankly, a lack of American engagement. I'll use some examples on that. We look at Egypt. The day, and I want to ask this question, but I will in a second. The day there was this change in Egypt, our administration was not really focused on going out and stressing support for the Egyptian people, stressing support for their change into a democracy. I look at the example of Benghazi and what happened there. I look at the status of forces agreement in Iraq and basically the ease to give up there and the quickness at which we walked away from the negotiating table. And today you look at Iraq and it's basically in chaos again, which to me personally is very disturbing. And you look at the administration floating the idea, even if they don't follow it, floating the idea of a zero-troop option in Afghanistan after 2014. That does nothing but embolden our enemy. That does nothing but embolden the forces that would fight against the United States. We have been fighting these proxy wars against Iran, against terror, for a very, very long time. And this is from somebody, by the way, one of 6 Republicans to vote to give the president authority to go into Libya, because I believe that was the right thing to do. But a couple of big questions. I want to talk, first off, I want to ask you, Ambassador Bolton, specifically about the, and I know this isn't exactly on topic, but the message that was sent the day the change happened in Egypt. What do you think the Egyptian people saw in the United States kind of lack of engagement on that transition?
Well, I think they see an incoherence in dealing with events in Egypt that has unfortunately characterized the response to the entire Arab Spring. If you go back to Mubarak's fall, I counted in the 31-day period from the time demonstrations began in Egypt to the time Mubarak stepped aside that the administration had 4 distinct positions. And the net of that, and I think essentially we saw a repetition when the demonstrators went into the streets in late June and early July, and the military finally stepped in on July the 3rd. The result is nobody knows where we stand. We don't gain points with any of the various competing factions or persuasions in the struggle, and overall we're left impotent as the situation deteriorates. And I think the debate we're having now over continued foreign assistance unfortunately helps show that. And I think the signal that it sends throughout the region, combined with an absence now of having done anything effective since September the 11th in Benghazi, is that America is uninterested, that we are declining in our ability to shape events in the region. And I think that's something that our adversaries and our friends alike both see, and they're calibrating their policies accordingly, unfortunately, for our interest.
Thank you. I'll ask each of you if you could just answer with basically one quick answer. What's more important to Iran, a healthy economy or nuclear weapons? Start with you, Dr. Brumberg.
Well, to the forces...
just very quickly.
When you say Iran, I'm not sure what you mean, but if you're talking about the forces that...
The regime.
Nuclear weapons. But if you're but I think Iran is much more than the regime, and I have to say this because this is not the conversation we're having. There was a force. There was a force that brought Rouhani into power. This is the force of the electorate. They want economic and political change, and
Well, that's great, and we've been talking about that for 20 years. The fact is the regime's in charge, and the regime is the one chasing nuclear weapons. Mr. Dubowitz?
We might have some disagreement on that.
Would you say healthy economy or nukes?
Regime survival. And if they think that a nuclear weapon can guarantee the survival of the regime, they will pursue it. If they think that there's a fundamental choice between a nuclear weapon and the survival of the regime, we may have a chance of breaking their nuclear will. But we need enhanced leverage. We can't be naive. This isn't the Harvard negotiation project.
Mr. Ambassador.
They want nuclear weapons, and I would say, please don't believe the official economic statistics. These are expert smugglers. With the largest Iranian diplomatic facility in the world is in Caracas, Venezuela. Because of their close cultural ties? No, because they're laundering their money through the Venezuelan banks.
Well, thank you. I have a million more questions, but my time's out.
Very good
so I yield
questions.
back.
Thank you so much. Mr. Schneider.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you to the witnesses. I'd like to pick up essentially where we left off, but as you talked about, Mr. Dubowitz, the desire of the Iranian regime is survival. And we saw in the recent election what to them appears to have been a surprise outcome with the election of Rouhani. How much impact, and this is to everyone, do you believe the economic struggles of the Iranian people had an influence on the outcome of the election, if at all?
Well, thank you for the question. I think the Supreme Leader doesn't fear the United States. He doesn't fear Israel. He fears his own people. He knows what he's done to his own people. He's brutalized them. He knows the sense of despair. And I think he was shocked by the election results. I mean, he was shocked that his preferred candidate, Saeed Jalili, lost, and that Rouhani won, not because it was a pro-Rouhani vote, but it was because it was an anti-Khamenei vote. And the vote was based on a sense of despair and depression and frustration with nuclear intransigence that's led to the economic demise of a proud nation that otherwise should be powerful and rich and influential. And so for that reason, I do think these sanctions are working, not in slowing down Iran's nuclear program, because that's clearly not happening, but in embittering the Iranian people, not against the United States, but against the Supreme Leader, the Revolutionary Guards, and a regime that has held them hostage for 30 years. Again, these sanctions can give us leverage. That's all they can give us is leverage. And how we use that leverage remains to be seen.
Dr. Brumberg, you're nodding your head.
Well, I agree with that. I mean, look, the sanctions will get the Iranian leadership to the table. What you decide to do at the table is the question. Whether you want to negotiate in the kinds of concessions that you ultimately want to provide, including on sanctions relief, that's the debate we need to have. What kind of relationship do we ultimately want with the Islamic Republic of Iran, assuming that we're not advocating regime change, if we want to find some way to live with this regime, which in many respects has been a repugnant regime. That's a conversation I think we often avoid. That's a strategic conversation we need to have. I also want to say on this issue of Rouhani and whether he's a moderate, and we have these debates, they go on forever. Rouhani is not really the story here. The story of the political and social forces that brought him into power, that have been struggling to be heard, and they count in the Islamic Republic system. I've been studying this system for years. It's not simply the supreme leader and the office of the president, which everybody predicted was going to be abolished, is not going to be abolished. There will be parliamentary elections in 2 years. The one thing the reformers desperately want is a peace process between the U.S. and Iran to create the space that they need for the long-term struggle for human rights in that country. Now, we have to decide whether we take that struggle seriously, and we want to help to foster it. Because short of regime change, the change in Iran will happen through, not against the system.
But Dr. Brumberg, in the sense of time, I only have 2 minutes left. Out of this committee and going to the floor today or tomorrow is a bill that strengthens the sanctions regime, that hopefully gives us that leverage to try to force the hand and change the course away from progress towards a nuclear capability. And it seems what I'm hearing is that those sanctions have had an effect on the economy. The effect on the economy has had effect on the polity, the politics in Iran. And so it seems to me that we should be pursuing more sanctions or stronger sanctions. Am I missing something?
I think the sanctions haven't had an effect on the polity. There's no doubt about it. But alone, the sanctions will not compel the Iranians to do what we think they should do. They will not do it by themselves. We have to sit down and negotiate and decide ultimately whether we are going to be living with sanctions forever or offer real incentives in return for a deal that we and the Iranians can accept. That's the conversation I don't think we're having.
The conversation we have here, sanctions are a means to an end. The sanctions aren't the goal. Preventing Iran from having a nuclear weapon is the goal. Mr. Dubowitz.
Well, there's a lot of talk in Washington about sweetening the offer, and we're not being generous enough to the Iranian regime. There is an offer on the table. It was presented at Almaty. It is a very good offer, despite the fact our administration officials go on background at describing the sanctions relief as modest. The offer says gold sanctions and petro sanctions, chemical sanctions relief worth tens of billions of dollars in exchange for 20% and the suspension of 20% enrichment. That is increasingly an irrelevant nuclear concession if you believe David Albright and nuclear experts who say we are moving to undetectable nuclear breakout. So there's an offer on the table. Let Rouhani respond to it before we talk about sweetening that offer or offering generous sanctions relief. We should be enhancing our negotiating leverage, not diminishing it before we show up for the negotiations.
And my time is up as well. I have many more questions, but again, thank you for your time.
Thank you very much, sir. Mr. Weber of Texas.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'm going to follow up on that. Winston Churchill, Mr. Dubowitz, said that an appeaser is someone who feeds the crocodiles his friends one at a time, hoping it'll eat him last. Is that what's going on here? We're simply trying to appease them in a sanction process, and they're going to get the nuclear weapons. Is that your best opinion?
You know, I don't like to use the word appeasement, because I think that everybody who is engaged in this has the best of intentions and is trying to figure out how to deal with a very complicated diplomatic issue. I do think that we tend to take a very Western approach to this, you know, where we're all trained in sort of negotiating tactics, that we want to have a good relationship, we want to expand the community of interests, we want to look for different options, we want to find a deal. Well, the fact of the matter is we are negotiating against hardened negotiators who employ
one who's already misled the United States and boasted about it.
They've absolutely done so. So this Rouhani-phoria that has followed the election of Mr. Rouhani, I think has to be treated with a high degree of skepticism, not because only of his track record, but the track record of the Supreme Leader and the fact that these are men who understand the nuclear file and have forgotten tricks we haven't even learned.
All right, let me move from that to one of my colleagues, Mr. Deutsch, down on the other side of the podium here, said that they were, I believe, sending around $500 million a month into Syria and 500 tons of cargo a day, if I remember him correctly. Were you all aware of that? And you think that's pretty accurate? Based on $500 million a month, now you've talked about their surplus, I think. How long can they do that?
Well, I think that's the essential question. I mean, if we know what the size of their accessible foreign exchange reserves are, and we know how much money they've got in the bank, then we have a pretty good sense of how long they can do that.
So do the math. How long is it?
Well, you know, that's the question you need to ask the administration.
Let me move over to
in a
Ambassador
classified
Bolton.
setting.
I don't think we know what Iran's foreign exchange reserves are. I don't think they've been honest over the past decade in declaring what their reserves are and where they are. I don't think they're being honest today about their oil exports. I don't think they're recording as official exports the oil they're trucking through Kurdistan into Turkey. I don't think we're calculating the oil they're shipping through Iraq as Iraqi oil.
In other words, you think they would purposefully mislead us?
I know it's shocking.
Golly. Let me move on.
That's the way it goes.
Let me move on. So you say if the Israelis have that airstrike, if they issue that strike, that Iran most assuredly will retaliate, and I think you said by unleashing Hezbollah to just unbelievable rocket barrage. Of course, we have the Iron Dome in place. Any idea of what kind of sustained barrage and how long that would go on?
Well, I think the Iranian calculus, although you can never be sure with a regime of that nature, is that they can intimidate Israel into not acting by threatening Israel's civilian population. And I think the supplies and the personnel that they have put into the Bekaa Valley for Hezbollah since the end of the Israel-Hezbollah war in 2006 is very, very frightening. I think their efforts, which are continuing to put at least a modest missile capability in Hamas's hands in the Gaza Strip, all make this an extraordinarily difficult decision for Israel, which is what it's calculated to do. And I think that's why we have to look at this from the perspective that there's not much time for Israel to make a decision whether it's going to use
Well, it's just delayed annihilation, if you will. I mean, they can either go ahead and stop the process now or be confronted with it later.
Or they can risk the very real possibility that we've all miscalculated,
Right.
and that Iran has facilities we don't know about,
Right.
or that they're working with North Korea, or many other things that put them much closer, not just to 1 or 2 nuclear weapons, but to scores of nuclear weapons.
No, I would agree with that. Now, let me move back to you, is it Dubowitz or Dubowitz?
Dubowitz.
Dubowitz. You said earlier that not killing Christians, women, and children should not be the framework for concessions in your prepared remarks. Would you reiterate that?
Well, what I said is that if Mr. Rouhani and this regime were to actually
come to the table
demonstrate
in good
their
faith.
moderation,
Sure.
They should stop killing Syrian women and children. But we shouldn't reward them for that.
So
That should be
we're
the
not
definition of
you're
moderation.
not saying that we're negotiating with that right now.
No, we're not negotiating with that right now. What I'm suggesting is that we try to view Mr. Rouhani through the prism of the nuclear file all the time, and I think what we try to do in this hearing, given the nexus, is to view him through the prism of Syria, where Mr. Rouhani and this regime are complicit in the slaughter of tens of thousands of Syrians, including women and children. And that should give us pause.
Oh, absolutely.
We sit down with this man.
And that's a great point. I appreciate you making it. Madam Chair, I yield back.
Thank you, sir. My Florida colleague, Ms. Frankel.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So first of all, thank you all for your service. And to me, this is an example of very smart, committed people with very different opinions on things. And I just want to say as an aside that I'm personally happy that our Secretary of State is trying for peace in the Middle East, and I hope and I expect that he will not lose focus on Iran and Syria and the rest of the chaos. Mr. Bolton, I think I heard you say that you do not believe, as to Iran, that sanctions are working. So I want to just ask you specifically, are you suggesting a military intervention to stop a nuclear power? And, well, let me ask my other questions. And then I think, Mr. Dubowitz, I think I heard you say that you think we should have more sanctions, but the sanctions should just be related to Iran and Iran trying to obtain nuclear power, but should not be related to its action in Syria. I think you said that. No, you didn't say that. Well, maybe you could explain that.
Sure.
Well, let's start with those 2 questions, and then we'll go from there.
There is simply no evidence that the sanctions have had any impact on Iran's nuclear weapons program. And given that with the amount of uranium they've enriched to reactor grade already, if they were racing to create nuclear weapons, they could do it within about 4 months. So the notion that continuing to ratchet up the sanctions at some point will prevent them from getting nuclear weapons simply misses the reality. I think, and I want to say this very carefully, objectively speaking, focusing on sanctions almost guarantees that Iran will get nuclear weapons because they are that close. I do believe that the only option is a preemptive military strike against Iran's nuclear program. I believe that for quite some number of years. And I know this is a very, very unattractive option, but it is a far worse option to contemplate Iran with nuclear weapons, not only because of what that regime could do with those weapons, but because it doesn't stop with Iran. As Secretary of State Clinton said over a year ago, if Iran gets nuclear weapons, so will Saudi Arabia, so will Egypt, so will Turkey, so will others.
Mr. Bolton, thank you. Can I just have the other 2 gentlemen comment on that and give me your opinion of a scenario of what would happen if there was a military intervention?
Well, I think there's another scenario, which is not necessarily to launch a military strike, but actually to enhance the credibility that we were serious about using a military option if all other options were exhausted. I mean, I think one of the fundamental problems of our Iran policy has been that the Supreme Leader does not believe the United States, and I don't think even believes Israel, that we are serious about using military force to destroy his nuclear facilities. I think if he thought so and actually believed that, we would have a much better chance of finding a peaceful resolution to this problem at the negotiating table through a combination of economic pressure and a credible military threat. We may not actually have to launch those military strikes in order to get that deal, but we've got to enhance the credibility of the threat.
How is that done?
Well, it's done through the rhetoric of the president. It's done through the positioning of military assets. It's done through selected leaks. It's done through arming our allies. It's done through a variety of ways that signal to the Iranians that this president is serious about using military force to stop a critical nuclear capability, not just a nuclear weapon.
Mr. Brumberg?
I have to admit I'm not an expert on these strategic matters. I have spent, however, a lot of time sitting with the experts here in Washington, and I might add in Israel, talking about this very subject. And I have not run into serious people who do serious work on this question who would argue that using force is an obvious or inevitably successful strategy. In fact, quite the contrary. I hear it over and over again that it will be a boomerang. But why? Because a serious military strike is not something that you have overnight and disappear. It takes weeks. You have to make sure the Iranians cannot retaliate. So when you talk about a strike, let's understand what we're talking about. We're talking about going to war. Now, that's what I was saying before. I'm not advocating going to war, but I think that discussion just gets around what the real options are. We have to stand up and say, if we want war, then make the argument. It's no point in threatening war unless you're ready to go to war. And as from what I can tell, again, working with my Israeli friends, the debate in Israel is rich and complex, and the military people there are not convinced that the military strike is the obvious way to go. And moreover, they don't necessarily believe that it is possible for them to do it without the U.S. involvement in a major, sustained set of strikes lasting weeks, if not longer. So if this is the solution, and we think at the end of the day we will have resolve this with all the cost to the region and the cost to the hopes for reform in Iran, then let's make that argument. But if we don't really want that outcome, then let's talk about the real possibilities. And I think that often the conversation really doesn't get down to the nitty-gritty. And while I obviously disagree with Ambassador Bolton in some respects, I respect his readiness to at least articulate what he thinks the ultimate real option is, which is war. And if that's the way we want to go, I mean, then let's make the argument. But I don't think it's the obvious solution. And I think that threatening war when you know that the consequences are going to be very bad isn't an especially good idea.
Well, remembering that this is an Iran-Syria Nexus hearing, remember there are Iranian assets in Syria as well. I mean, the Revolutionary Guard assets, Quds Force assets in Syria. The Israelis have reportedly launched 4 airstrikes against assets in Syria. Hezbollah assets in Syria. They've penetrated Syrian air defenses. There's been no blowback, no consequences. They've lost no planes, no pilots. It does suggest that the U.S. has other strike options. They may not entail blowing up Iran's nuclear facilities, but in fact may entail going after Iranian assets in Syria selectively to once again send a message of resolve. I don't think it's an either-or between, appeasement and a full-scale military intervention with 150,000 soldiers climbing through the mountains of Iran. There are other options as we look at this trajectory.
Thank you. And my other Florida colleague, Mr. DeSantis.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman. I appreciate the testimony. I was reading in the paper when they had the Iranian election, and Wall Street Journal, Washington Post, all of them, moderate wins Iranian election. And we even have a letter now that's circulating amongst my colleagues in the House. I think there's over 130 of them who've said, hey, this guy's a moderate, this is a chance to get some negotiations. And, I just find that to be incredibly naive. To describe him as a moderate in a way that we would kind of think of it here is very misleading. So, Ambassador Bolton, what's your sense on Hassan Rouhani and this idea that he's some kind of a moderate? Do you agree with that, and do you think that it's worth negotiating with this regime?
No, I don't think it's worth negotiating. We've negotiated for 10 years, and at some point you can say how much longer we have to wait. The criticism of Ahmadinejad when he was president by the so-called moderates had nothing to do with his objective to get a deliverable nuclear weapons capability. It was that he talked about wiping Israel off the face of the earth, that he boasted about the nuclear weapons program, that he went on public relations tours of the centrifuge facility at Natanz, that he kept talking about it. And the argument by the leaders like Rafsanjani and others was, stop talking about it. You're getting the West agitated. They're paying attention to it. And I think Rouhani is perfectly positioned to play exactly that kind of strategy, to allay the fears, to have negotiations, to make meaningless concessions, all the while Iran's nuclear infrastructure grows broader and deeper. And just one piece that we haven't talked about today, the IAEA in its last quarterly report estimates that the heavy water production facility and the heavy water reactor at Arak will be online next year. And that is an even more efficient way to produce plutonium for the plutonium route to nuclear weapons. There is no power generating capacity in Iraq to use the output of the heavy water reactor. It can only have a weapons purpose, and it's going right along.
With respect to Iran's pursuit of nuclear weapons and Israel's response, you talked about an Israeli strike. I think in your testimony you meant a strike on the actual reactors. One of the gentlemen up here mentioned some of their other assets in the region. So, Ambassador Bolton, do you think a strike against some of these other assets in the region, but not necessarily a strike on the Iraqi or on the Iranian nuclear facilities itself, would be effective or sufficient?
No, I don't. I think what any strike has to do is break Iran's control over the nuclear fuel cycle at certain key points. You don't have to destroy all their facilities. But at a minimum, I think you need to prevent their capacity to enrich uranium and the even more vulnerable link, their capacity to convert uranium from a solid into a gas. This is the Esfahan conversion facility. We know where it is. It's all above ground. We don't think there's an alternative. The risk of not acting as every day goes by is simply that Iran increases the potential to have redundant facilities that we don't know about. And for all this discussion that we've had here today and we have in the general public debate, we ought to be a little bit more humble about our intelligence about what's actually going on in Iran. We've had problems overestimating our accuracy before. And that's why the notion that we have an essentially unlimited time to negotiate is very, very dangerous.
And I know this is about the Syria-Iran nexus, but with respect to the Israeli-Palestinian issue, I think it's relevant because it kind of feeds into this idea that we can get further in negotiations and we may have to. I know Israel has agreed to give up 100 or so Palestinian prisoners, terrorists. And it's frustrating to me because, to me, I think that sends the wrong signal to the Palestinians, almost a reward in some ways. I don't think that that's going to lead to any type of lasting settlement. But what are your thoughts on what's going on with that situation?
No, I think the release of the prisoners was clearly as a result of the pressure of the United States. I don't think that will fundamentally change the negotiating dynamic. And I think the ultimate outcome is that we're going to be left pretty much in the place that we were before. I do think, to the extent that it reflects an investment of American prestige in an effort that's almost certainly doomed to failure, it will leave the United States, when that occurs, in yet even weaker a position in the region as a whole than we are already.
Well, I appreciate that, and thank you, Madam Chairwoman.
Thank you, sir. Mr. Connolly of Virginia.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman. And you may not remember that I was once a Senate staffer on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, but in 1981, I staffed the nomination hearing for a young person named John Bolton, who was
young ones?
He was young. He had no gray hair. He still had the mustache, though.
Much like you.
Yeah, that's right. He aged. I don't know what happened to me. Well, starting with you, Mr. Ambassador, you sound pretty gloomy. You have no faith in the restart of peace negotiations undertaken by Secretary Kerry, and you think that there's really no alternative but to a preemptive strike to take out the nuclear capability that's being developed in Iran. Is that correct?
Yeah, it's a very, very unattractive alternative, but I think you have to look at it this way. If the choice were between the world as it is today compared to the world after an Israeli strike, we would all prefer the world as it is today, of course. But that's not the choice that Israel faces or that the United States faces. The choice is between the world after an Israeli strike compared to a world where Iran has nuclear weapons. And it's in that circumstance where that's the decision that the resort to preemptive military force, as Israel has twice before done against this program, I think is the only other option.
So
What about a U.S. option?
the Israelis should, in your view, and we should encourage them, by extension, I assume, undertake this preemptive action. Any kind of timeline?
The sooner the better. I mean, look, the Israelis unambiguously would prefer that the United States do this because they know our capacity is much greater, our ability to sustain the operation over a long period of time is much greater. And it's true that the United States has said in both the last administration and this one that all options are on the table, but nobody believes that. Nobody believes it in Israel, and nobody believes it in Iran. That's why the spotlight is on Israel. They don't want it on Israel, but that's the choice. And I think if they don't act in the very near future, then the almost certain outcome is that Iran gets nuclear weapons, and very, very soon. And if that happens, as I said a moment ago, I think at least 3 other countries in the region move quickly to get nuclear weapons themselves.
What about trying, before you sort of undertake a preemptive strike, presumably you've got to do some calculus about the consequences. Now, some have posited that this is very different than taking out a capacity in Syria or the previous taking out of a reactor in Iraq. This is very different, and that you're talking about potentially region-wide, reactions that could be deeply and profoundly injurious to the interest of Israel and, by extension, us. So how would you address that, Mr. Besser, since you've called for the preemptive strike?
Yeah, well, I have written, and I'll try and summarize what I think the Iranian reaction would be. But let me say first, in terms of the reaction in the region, the Arab states of the peninsula on the other side of the Gulf would welcome the elimination of the Iranian nuclear weapons program. They may not say that publicly, but in private, they fear Iran with nuclear weapons almost as much as Israel does. I think that Iran itself then would have some hard decisions about how to respond. I do not think that they would close the Strait of Hormuz. I do not think they would attack deployed American forces in the region or the Arab states on the other side of the Gulf, because that would bring us in. And as I said before, you can never be certain with this regime, but I think by process of elimination, you conclude the most likely Iranian retaliation is to have Hezbollah and Hamas attack Israel, which is why prompt American support, if Israel does decide to attack, is so important to resupply the planes they will undoubtedly lose in large numbers over Iran, so that they can gain air supremacy over the Bekaa Valley and the Gaza Strip to suppress that rocket fire.
Madam Chairwoman, if you would allow Mr. Dubowitz and Dr. Brumberg to simply have the opportunity to respond. I thank you.
Yeah. Congressman, I actually think that there's another risk, that the Iranians may not dash to a nuclear weapon quickly, prompting or at least before that, prompting Israel, the United States to have to move quickly. The Iranian endgame actually may have a middle point, and the middle point is to establish critical nuclear capability where they are at the point of undetectable nuclear breakout, where they can break out without the IAEA or Western intelligence knowing about it. And then in doing so, establish an industrial-sized nuclear capacity so they can produce not one weapon, but multiple weapons, and then stop. And at that critical point where they have the ability to turn a screw and build a nuclear weapon, they stop, and they say to the international community, we now have an industrial-sized program with undetectable breakout, and here are our demands: massive sanctions relief, recognize our interests in Syria, Afghanistan, Iraq, Bahrain, and elsewhere, and don't force us to build a bomb. You know, the Supreme Leader has the supposed fatwa against a nuclear weapon. Well, we don't want a nuclear weapon, so don't force our hand. And in doing so, have all of the leverage and turn the tables on the international community, get massive sanctions relief, get the oil flowing, get the economy stabilized, and then at some point, because I think it is absolutely in the Supreme Leader's DNA, then dash to a weapon, and dash to a weapon with a strong economy and without sanctions in place. That may be a potential end game that I think we should be very conscious and very wary of.
Well, I think this discussion illustrates anything, it's the lack of good alternatives. I mean, I think we all recognize, listening to this discussion as we're trying to work out a very difficult situation, that that many of the alternatives are worse than the other. The Israelis themselves, from what I know, speaking to the experts, don't believe that they have the ordnance to undertake an effective strike by themselves. And therefore, there's no such thing as successful or effort to be successful on the military front without a concerted, extended, protracted bombing campaign supported by the U.S. And again, there's no guarantee that it will be successful, and it may have regional effects that we can't imagine. It may be disaster, and that's disastrous. That's why the Israelis are so worried and are not necessarily adamant for making the kinds of moves that some are advocating. I might also just add one more remark here, and that is, we talk about the Iranians looking for capacity and having the capacity, and what that means. It's a very complex issue. Can we negotiate under those circumstances an agreement that we can accept? Perhaps not, perhaps so. We don't really know. This is a matter to be addressed through negotiations. Unless we simply don't want to have negotiations, then the war option is really the only one, and it's not a good one either. So I think that all the alternatives are bad. I myself have made the argument that we should, at the very least, test the opportunity before us, because the situation is much more that cannot be reduced to one man or one position, but is a complex one in which we have a serious process of change going on in Iran, and let's not blow that up as well.
Thank you. Thank you, Madam Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Connolly. I hope your cold gets better. And Mr. Deutsch and I have packed this subcommittee of Floridians, so very pleased to yield to Dr. Yoho of Florida.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I appreciate the opportunity, and I enjoy you guys and your testimony. What I see is our foreign policy as a circle. It's like a tiger chasing its tail for the last 25 to 30 years. You know, stop Iran from developing a nuclear weapon, sanctions, the threat of war, the IAEA inspectors, in the hopes that Iran will not develop a nuclear war. Mr. Bolton, or Ambassador Bolton, in your book, Surrender is Not an Option, for over 20 years, we and other nations in the world have attempted to dissuade Iran from developing a nuclear weapon, but yet they get closer decade by decade, year by year, day by day. And we send the IAEA in there, and they get hoodwinked. And then, you know, Iran says we're not doing it, but we know they are, and they have been. I mean, the proof's in the pudding right now. What other strategies, other than the sanctions that we have talked about and the threat of war, would you recommend? And this is for all three of you. And what, in your opinion, and I know this is crazy, but play along with me here, because the last 30 years have been kind of crazy. And this has happened before with Pakistan developing a nuclear weapon, and then India said it couldn't be done, and then North Korea and China. What would happen if, as Mr. Dubowitz said, the end game, if they were allowed, not allowed, but if they developed that, and then we had a different strategy, thinking outside of the box, and say, you know what, if you have that, you just better be careful how you use it, because the rest of the world is going to respond. I mean, I know I have not heard anybody talk about that, but yet you said your end game is getting Iran that close to developing a nuclear weapon. And if they get that close, they have the negotiation power. And it sounds to me like they're going to get that anyways. So what happens if we change the policy and said, you know what, if you get that, you need to be very, very careful? I'd like to hear your comments on that.
Well, I think the idea that if they get nuclear weapons, they can be contained and deterred is a strategy that's doomed to leave Israel and our Arab friends in the region in grave peril forever. And in fact, given Iran's support for international terrorism over the years, would lead to the potential of them assisting terrorists in exploding a nuclear device anywhere on Earth, whether they ever get the ballistic missile capability to deliver it that way or not. And as I said a moment ago, once that happens, even if I'm wrong that you cannot contain and deter a nuclear Iran, it doesn't stop there. You've got the proliferation to the Saudis, to Egypt, to Turkey, and others that takes an already very dangerous environment in the Middle East and ratchets it up to half a dozen nuclear weapon states in a relatively short period of time. And that, too, is a prescription for disaster. So that's why I think it's been so important to focus on stopping Iran in the first place. And the idea that there's some level that people would allow them to be comfortable with, but not actually, for example, testing nuclear weapons, I think is a mistake, because I think the proliferation will occur anyway. If you have trouble sleeping some night, just read books about India's recessed deterrent policy.
I have.
In the decades before they detonated weapons in 1998. They did have everything but turning the last screw, and everybody knew it, and that's why Pakistan got nuclear weapons. And that is proliferation at work. That's why, as I say, the ultimate conclusion has to be to stop Iran in the first instance, and we're very nearly out of time to do that.
Well, I absolutely agree. I mean, I think Iran as a threshold nuclear power would be as dangerous as Iran with nuclear weapons, which is why we must ensure they don't get there. And these notions of giving Iran the right to enrichment or having it have domestic enrichment, I think, are fanciful, because ultimately this is a regime that has shown itself willing to rapaciously cheat and deceive, and if it has domestic enrichment, it will do so. Just to answer your question, sir, I think that there is more we can do to show the Supreme Leader that we are serious. I mean, if you look at it from his perspective, Iranian provocation in Iraq, in Afghanistan, around the world, including trying to blow up a restaurant in Georgetown, Washington, has been met with nothing, no response, court hearings, prosecutions, angry words, and even on the sanctions front, targeted sanctions, graduated sanctions, focused sanctions. We haven't responded in a massive way. On the sanctions side, it needs to be massive sanctions leading to economic collapse. We should be responding in places like Syria, not with UN Council recommendations or Geneva II peace conferences, but with actually killing Iranian IRGC Quds First commanders in Syria. I mean, they're there, they're on the ground. We should be taking them out. That will send a message that we're serious.
Madam Chair, can the next witness answer that?
Absolutely, Dr.
Thank you, ma'am.
Yahoo.
Well, I think you put your finger on the question, and that is there any level of enrichment that we can live with in a negotiated settlement? Now, if the perspective of the United States and our European allies is there's no level of enrichment on Iranian soil acceptable, there is no basis for an agreement, and we should simply stop negotiating and consider the options which we've already talked about. I am not convinced that this is the basis for a negotiation, and I don't think whatever administration was sitting in the White House would necessarily agree to that premise, because it only narrows your options and precludes negotiations. So once again, this is really about ultimately what is the end game of a negotiation, what are you prepared to live with? And that's a discussion that neither the Iranians nor the Americans are very likely or happy to have. We keep dancing around it. In some sense, we're making progress here because at least we're having that discussion. But that's really the ultimate question, and we can have a useful debate about that.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Mr. Messer, you are our cleanup batter hitter. Come on, out of the ballpark.
Well, thank you, Madam Chair. Certainly appreciate the testimony today and have learned a lot listening. I think in the last couple questioners, you know, often when we go through these conversations, we assume that it's a given that Iran we cannot have a nuclear Iran, and yet then don't talk about the consequences of what that really means. I think in the last couple questioners we managed to get there. So I'll skip through the questions I was going to ask there and just say, in my view, I think shared by at least two of the three on the panel, there is no world in which it's acceptable to have a nuclear Iran. The world would be forever changed, and we have to do whatever we can, even the most unsavory of options, to make sure that that doesn't happen. This hearing is about the nexus between Syria and Iran, and obviously in the world we live in today, there's an awful lot of events happening in Syria. So I would just ask the panelists to assess where they see events in Syria today, the stability of the Assad regime, and how does this nexus change in a world if Assad falls?
Well, let me just address one aspect we haven't talked a lot about in connection with Syria, and that's the effective confluence of interest between Iran and Russia in keeping Assad in power. I think that's very important for a lot of reasons, and I think that's why you see the momentum, the dynamic in the conflict having shifted these past several months. It's certainly not over yet. We've been up and down and all around in Syria over the past 2 years. I don't think you can predict at this point even yet what the outcome will be. But Russia and Iran have worked effectively to keep the Assad regime propped up when it looked like it was about to go down. And that is significant, I think, because of the larger regional implications. Russia and China cast 3 double vetoes in the Security Council of U.S. and European proposed sanctions. They're going to do whatever they can to keep Assad in power, as Iran will. And that's one reason why I worry, in the midst of all this chaos in the other countries in the region, that the Russians see an opportunity, maybe not to get back to where they were in Soviet days before Sadat took office in Egypt, but they see the potential to expand Russian influence in the region that they haven't had in a long time. And so that's why this conflict in Syria is so important to them. And I think we've missed this in the last 2 years. We believed for a long time we could negotiate with Russia to ease Assad out of power. It was never going to happen. And I think the Obama administration was reluctant to take Iran on in the early days of Syria because that would tank whatever prospects there were of negotiating with Iran about the nuclear weapons program. That's the linkage point right there. So I think it's a very, very troubling time from that perspective, and that Russian-Iranian cooperation isn't ending in Syria. You're going to continue to see it as the Russians, for reasons of their own and very mistakenly, in my view, but as they continue to fly political cover for Iran on this issue.
Okay, thanks. The other panelists.
Well, with respect to Syria, I mean, again, I think the Iranian game there is to establish a different kind of critical capability. In that case, to establish what my FDD colleague Tony Badran has called Allawistan. So Assad is winning. Assad will probably not have control over all of Syria, but if he could control a landmass that stretches from Latakia in the north to Tartus on the border of Lebanon in the south, includes Homs in Damascus, with territorial contiguity with Lebanon, which provides a land bridge to Hezbollah, then he has Allawistan. He has a landmass, a launching pad for Iranian influence in that region. And that's a different kind of critical capability than we talked about on the nuclear side, which is threshold critical capability. I think on the issue of how we deal with this, and this is the response to my friend over here, I mean, I think we make a big mistake when we negotiate with the Iranians in responding to an Iranian declaration that something is non-negotiable by saying, okay, it's non-negotiable. Well, then we'll take it off the table. So the right to enrichment, domestic enrichment, non-negotiable. We won't have a deal unless
Particularly when the result is non-negotiable.
Well, that's right. And I think that that's just a big mistake in negotiating with men who employ brinkmanship. Everything is negotiable. And in fact, what we need to be doing is what the Iranians are doing, creating facts on the ground in the way that they create centrifuges on the ground, enrichment stockpiling, and critical territory in Syria. We need to be creating our own facts on the ground to use as leverage in a negotiation process where we can actually come to some peaceful determination.
Okay. Madam Chair, with your permission, Mr. Brumberg.
Absolutely, without objection.
I think we all can agree that the situation in Syria is disastrous on many levels, and one of which we've already mentioned briefly, and that is it's been the basis for an escalation of a sectarian war between Sunnis and Shiites throughout the region. And that is feeding the jihadist movements everywhere, including, of course, now in Sinai, which has become a huge problem. And what's interesting is that in Iran, there's a considerable debate about this, because they know the blowback of their so-called success in Syria will come to haunt them. And this has implications for Iran's own security. If Lebanon and it falls apart and Hezbollah is completely dragged into a sectarian war, Iran's own interests will not be defended, and in fact will be undermined. So the Iranians are having an interesting debate about this. The incoming president and the people around him are surely aware of it. They've talked about it, and they're going to have to deal with the unintended consequences of their so-called victory in Syria.
Thank you so much, and I thank the witnesses for excellent testimony, and I do agree with Ambassador Bolton. In an ideal world, peace between Israel and the Palestinians, always a wonderful thing, but meanwhile, we can only have so many hours in the day. You have to focus on what's happening. We've got Egypt in crisis. We've got Iran close to nuclear weapons. We've got bloodshed in Syria, and look what this administration is doing. Anyway, With that, the subcommittee is adjourned. Thank you, gentlemen. Thank you to the audience as well.
Thanks, sir. That was fun. It was fun. Thanks, Professor. Nice to see you.